So in this video, we're almost ready to install Active Directory domain services to both of our domain controllers. However, there's two things that we need to do first. First is the computer name. So on my MIIM SVRDC0001, if you noticed at install, it gave it this crazy name by default when I did the install. If I wanted to, I could give it a computer description here, but I'll choose here to change the name. So the first name of my first server is MIIM SVRDC for domain controller 0001. I'll put that in and I'll say OK. And it's going to ask me to restart the server to change that name. So I'll go ahead and do that. And I'll pause the video while I rename the second server. So as you can see here, I've renamed my second server. I'm going to go ahead and choose OK. And it again will ask me to restart the server, which I'll say OK. I'll close this out and I will restart now. I've gone ahead and restarted the first server, so we'll go back to that. I'll log in. And the last thing we need to do before installing the Active Directory role is to give this server a static IP address. Now, as you may remember, we put this on a virtual network of a 172.16.0.0 network. So when this comes up, I'm going to choose the Ethernet adapter, right-click, go to Properties, go to IPv4, choose Properties, and as you can see, I've already assigned it the 172.16.0.10 IP address. I've also given it a gateway, and I'm leaving the preferred DNS blank because as I install Active Directory on this first server, it of course will install DNS. Active Directory is heavily reliant on DNS. So we've checked that, made sure it's correct. We have the right server name for the first server, and we're ready to install. So at this point, we'll go to Manage, Add Roles and Features. We'll choose Next. Next. There's our server that we want to install in. That's going to be our local server, and choose Next. At this point, we will choose Active Directory Domain Services and allow it to install the additional features that it needs. We'll choose Next. It's got additional features here. We'll choose Next. ADDS, just confirm, Next. And at this point, we can go ahead and click right here for it to automatically restart if needed and choose Install. Now, be clear that what we're doing here is simply installing the role. We are not yet configuring Active Directory. Once the role is installed, we'll go ahead and configure our first domain controller. Then we'll go ahead and configure the second. So while this is going on, we can come over to the second and do the same thing. Now, the only thing we can do here is configure our IP address and install the role. We're not yet, though, going to be able to configure the role because our DC server, our secondary server, is going to need to pick up information from the primary configuration. So I'll go in here, Properties, and I'll just pause the video while I put in this information. Now, as you can see, I've given this one a .11 static IP address. Here is the key. So that we don't forget, right now I'm going to go in and give this second domain controller the preferred DNS, pointing it to the first. So if you remember, that was a 172.16.0.10. Let me put that in. So there is the IP address pointing to the initial DNS that will be configured when we configure Active Directory on DC0001. So at this point, I'll say OK, close. If you notice, it's ready to connect to our network. I'll say yes. I'll close this out. And now I'll go in and again, simply install the Active Directory role, not configure it. So Active Directory Domain Services, add all the additional features, choose Next, and continue on with the process until I'm ready to install. So let's go check how our first server is doing. You notice it's done and it's ready to promote the server to a domain controller. So we can click here, or if we happen to accidentally close that box, we can come up here to the yellow exclamation point and also configure from here. So we'll do that real quick. And in this case, we want to add a brand new forest. We're going to give it the root domain of, in my case, corporate.miim.com, and choose Next. Because we are starting with server 2012 R2, we can make both our forest and our domain functional level that. We will go ahead and put in a password for the directory services restore mode. Now this is one of those passwords that if this was a production environment, I would want a very unique, very complex password here. Write it down someplace, put it in a red envelope, put it in a safe place just in case we ever had to reinstall directory services. I'll choose Next. You notice we get this delegation error in regards to DNS, and that's because we don't, as of yet, have a DNS server in this domain. So we'll choose Next. And I'll pause while it just briefly goes through to figure out the NetBIOS name. Most likely we'll come back with Corp. And that didn't take long at all. There's Corp for the next BIOS name, NetBIOS name. I'll choose Next. Now here is the key. If you remember, we created an additional hard drive where we want to actually install these sysvol files, the NTDS database and the sysvol. So as you can tell, I'm simply changing my path out to that S drive letter, making sure they're all correct, choosing Next. I'm going to go ahead and confirm where things are going to get installed. I'll look at everything here just to make sure everything is correct. This is one of those things that if something is misspelled here and you didn't want to have to reinstall, you're going to be stuck with it. So I highly suggest going through here, making sure everything is correct. I definitely want to check those file paths, and I'll choose Next. At this point, it's just going to run a quick check, verifying the prerequisites before finalizing the install. So as you can see, we are going to get a couple errors in regards to DNS, again, because we don't have any, but what we're looking for is this final green check mark. At that point, we can do install. It's funny they call this install because it really is configuring Active Directory on this new domain controller. So I'll go ahead and pause while it completes. As you can see, it's done with all that. I'm going to go ahead and it's going to restart the server into the domain. It's applying the new security policy to the system, and we're ready to log in. If you notice now, we're logging in to the corporate Active Directory domain. So in our server manager, we're going to see a couple new indicators, both DNS and ADDS. There is our ADDS and our DNS. So at this point, let's go over and configure Active Directory on our second server. Now, just a quick reminder, pay close attention. This one's going to be a little different. We don't want to add a new forest. We want to add a new domain in an existing forest. So Oh, sorry, actually we want to add a domain controller to an existing for us. Sorry, it's late. What is that existing for us? Well, it's going to be that corp network. So once we select that, we're going to have to give credentials for the Active Directory administrator, which we'll do here. And I'm getting an error. Let me go ahead and fix it. It does help to put in the correct login credentials. We'll say OK. You notice we've got corp. If we wanted to, we could select. There's our domain that we want to add it to, the fully qualified domain. We'll choose next. Now we already know that DNS is functioning because of the fact that it was able to pull that information on the corp.miim.com. So if you notice here, it's going to make this one a domain name system server. It's going to give us that redundancy for DNS, and it also will be a global catalog server. We again need to give it the Active Directory restore mode password. We want to make this one the same. But again, something unique. I don't personally recommend the administrative password for this. Choose next. There's that DNS that we're used to. Now at this point, we can let it do any, because if you notice, there's only one DNS server in our Active Directory domain at this point. Or we can select it. Either way. Here, again, let's remember to change these to S. We'll double check our configuration. Choose next, and I'll pause while it completes. Once it completes the prerequisite check and we get that nice green check mark, we'll do our install. We'll go ahead and reboot this server. I'll pause while it does that. So there you have it. We're on DC0001. It's a domain controller. Here's DC0002, and it also is a domain controller. So that's it for this video. We'll see you next time when we'll add a client to our new Active Directory domain. Take care.